So, hello everybody. Good afternoon. Exactly 6 weeks after the first lecture, 18th of March, by Kyriaki Gotti, some people, Studio New York. Today we have the final 7th lecture of Gilles Retsin. In this pilot semester, we introduce successful and progressive studios, architects, artists, and educators from the US and Europe who are actively involved in academic research, from personalities of today, computational discourse, applied ecological architecture, artists fusing the medium of architecture and design, and to non-architecture media. Lecturers were musicology, Slavo Krečovič from Bratislava, Anuk Vyprecht, Miami, Mirka Brooks, former Studio New York, Milic, Boston, Lenka Petrakova, London, and Edward Kiel, Sauerbrunn, Berlin. I am pleased that today we can welcome Gilles Retsin, with whom UMPRUM and our Studio X3 has been in contact since 2015, when Gilles exhibited at the second Experimental Architecture Biennale and spoke at the symposium at the same time. At 2017, Length Chair for the exhibition of the academic platform of computational design, our exhibition in the school, Gallery, and contributed to the publication of the same named edited by Shota Tsikolia. More about today's guest, the director of the M.A. Architectural Design study program at University City London, Bartlett School of Architecture, would introduce my colleague Jan Pernetsky, to whom I sell the floor.
Thank you very much, Imro, for the introduction. You basically also said what I wanted to say about Gilles. We also met at our event that was organized in very late 2015 in Bratislava called the Research Meetup, which was a 3 days long lecture series where Gilles had his part, and we were very lucky about it. Gilles is also the major proponent of a movement in architecture that could be called discrete or discrete assembly architecture. And if you look at his work, you can see a gradual development from very fiber-like fluent design that already had some discrete qualities through a pure discrete designs, all the way to something that is very useful and modular and seems to be a meaningful residential modular system, which I hope he's going to talk about a little bit more today, because that's something that is quite new, and we haven't seen that back in our lecture. We also can debate or have some feedback on a previous lecture that we had by Neil Leach a couple of weeks ago, where Neil was referring to the discrete movement, and maybe I would be very interested to hear what Gilles has to say to that. We also spoke that today we will have a large Q&A part of this lecture. So I would like to invite everybody here on Zoom and on Facebook to take part. Otherwise, I will put all my questions out, but you will have a chance to ask. So thank you very much, Gilles, for taking the time to join our lecture series and to have the final lecture at the UMPRUM Architecture Lecture Series. And please, the stage is yours.
Great. Yeah, many thanks, Imro and Jan, for the invite. I'm very excited to be with you, albeit over Zoom. I have very good memories of going to both Prague and Bratislava for talks. It was always some of the kind of most vivid events that I really have fantastic memories of. So for today, yeah, I will talk mainly about the discrete, of course, also because I understand, I mean, I've been following what Jan is doing with, as you have also contributed some software recently in a way to the discrete discourse. So I'll mainly focus on that. And I also included maybe a bit more of a meta discourse about the role of technology in architecture. And I will kind of kick off with that, which is something I haven't done before. So we'll see how that goes, which is, I mean, indirectly responding to some of the ideas that Leach proposed last week. So with this, I'll share my screen. Go. I will ask the question of the 21st century. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, cool. All right. So the title of the lecture is what is new in architecture? A very, very big question, especially for anyone, you know, working on technological discourse. And I think this this kind of question is super interesting in architecture. And in a way, today we are very often, still when we look at this image here of Le Corbusier in Stuttgart, we are very often kind of confronted with this, this desire for novelty, right? And I think in many ways, like when I was a student, I was kind of presented that image and I looked at it, and there was always this kind of incredible contrast where you had the kind of feeling that architecture didn't move as fast as the rest of the world, right? That architecture had its kind of moment de gloire, its kind of glory moment, you know, during modernism, and was so much ahead, so far ahead of the rest of the world, but now we kind of seem a bit stuck. And it's really interesting to kind of interrogate that question of novelty, right? And especially that building, you know, this specific building or the work of Le Corbusier at the time, of course, I mean, maybe it looks very modern and new in this image, but, you know, you also need to kind of question, like, was it actually really new, right? And in what way was it really new? And of course, that has been critiqued by Colin Rowe in his essay, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, where he essentially says that, you know, modernism was never really modern. We have never really been modern. You know, the way that these villas were composed are still kind of very much inherited from classicism. They still maintain a function form balance that makes that ultimately they're not really modern, right? And then a similar kind of moment happened in a way which I thought was really interesting, a similar moment to the ideal villa moment, when Mario Carpo wrote the article Breaking the Curve in 2014 for Art Forum, where he essentially accused, I mean, not accused, I mean, he essentially mentioned that the parametric and the work of what we always associated with the digital, that in fact it was just modern and that it was not computational per se or digital per se. And that then kind of kickstarted, of course, a lot of debates. And yes, you could look in a way at always at architectural technologies and then kind of question if these new technologies, what are they actually fundamentally changing? And for example, here again, you know, we can have robots, you know, stacking bricks, but then how much does that, like, how does our conception of architecture also change with that, right? In a way, like if the question is about the differentiation of bricks, then of course, you know, you could also look back at other periods in time where that happens. And with Mario Carpo and his critique, of course, on parametricism and on the early digital, these are images from the 50s and 70s, Luigi Maretti, Heinz Isler, and of course, I mean, it doesn't have fundamentally anything to do with the digital. Those ideas were out there many, many decades ago. And you could have a kind of a similar feeling also with this one, which was just published a few days ago. Dutch couple moves into Europe's first fully 3D printed house. And of course, kind of, you know, my Facebook with all the architects was full of people saying, well, this house is not like innovative in any way, and it is not actually a new idea, and it's not pushing the boundaries. Look at the door, look at the interior. And of course, it's true, right? I mean, it is, on the one hand, it is kind of something radically new, but on the other hand, it's also extremely old-fashioned and kind of, you know, not interesting, right? Or the same with this, which, I mean, is more radical. It's a 3D printed earth houses by WASP. And then you can, again, question kind of, is this old or is this new, right? Because it's kind of very, very, in a way, it's very innovative, you know, a 3D printer that prints with earth, you know, directly from the soil, very short production chain. But then at the same time, it's kind of also a very primitive form of architecture. So you can kind of question if that's new or not. And that is not actually a negative critique. So I do that also with my own work, and I kind of take a position basically on the relationship between, the kind of primitive nature of architecture and technology. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So we're kind of now with the kind of the latest kind of thing that happens in computational architectural discourse is, of course, research into AI, with it becoming more and more accessible with machine learning. And then you can ask, I mean, I think it's extremely important to ask the same question, right? To how are we creating something new? And is it actually new? What is the role of it? And kind of critically interrogate it. And especially, I mean, in the case of machine learning, it's quite interesting because in a way it's always reactive, right? You always need to feed it data that already exists for it to produce something. So it's a kind of has an extremely reactive relationship in a way with what has already been done and with the past. And it's really important to understand, like, for example, in these images by Stanislas Chailloux, of course, there is a very new and extremely interesting process at work, right? Where you can kind of generate these floor plans. But at the same time, the question is like, once they are generated, I mean, how much does it actually kind of change architecture? Like what has actually changed when we're looking at this image? And for example, I mean, the entire supply chain, the entire way that the process of architecture would still roughly, would still remain the same, right? We would still kind of ultimately have to build this specific floor plan with the tools that we have today. So it kind of keeps in place the role of the architect in itself. Like the architect is the one who, comes up with the idea and draws the plan, and maybe the AI takes over a part of that, but it still kind of maintains this traditional supply chain. It doesn't actually disrupt a kind of our understanding so much about architecture and construction. And that was, I thought it was really interesting last week to see how there was a question by Imro last week or 2 weeks ago with Leach's lecture, where he was asking, I think, a very fundamental question, whether architecture had stopped after Zaha and Gehry and the whole deconstructivist gang. And I thought that was a very radical question, right? Because in a way, in the work that was being shown, it kind of really, it kind of took a position that this is kind of the canon, right? That's like architecture. This is success. This is interest, and that the challenge in a way for architects to continue from there is kind of, as like the kind of messages, as long as we learn all of this stuff and we put that in our AI, then, we can, you will be able to do a successful design, right? Because this was successful, this is interesting, that's what we're told. So if we recycle that stuff, whatever you will do will also be interesting. And it maintains, and I think that's really important, it maintains, for me, it's a very conservative position on architecture, because it maintains the idea of the master architect, it maintains the idea, the kind of very old Albertian paradigm that the architect is kind of the napkin sketch, the kind of intellectual inputs, and then the napkin sketch gets sent to other people to be drawn into plans, and then ultimately it gets executed on site, right? And that is exactly how architecture has worked for many, many, many decades. So if you're looking at things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, wouldn't we, you would expect that it would have a deeper impact, right, on architecture than kind of just, taking over that little part and kind of maintaining that idea of the 90s of the kind of, the kind of star architect with a inventing kind of crazy forms, right? And again, like, it doesn't make any difference, right? Like these people that you would see here that are building a stadium in Qatar, that could be an AI designed stadium that was fed like 5,000 images of Himmelblau or Morphosis. But I mean, the reality on the ground would still be the same, right? So I think it's a very conservative idea to kind of look at architecture in that way. And in a way, if you look at what, the kind of the whole premise of digital fabrication, which was obviously a big hype, and I mean, still continues as something I think that is really thriving and interesting. The whole premise of that, like of this simple robot that is stacking bricks, the robot that I just accused of doing the same thing as that happened in the early 20th century, that robot does change something fundamentally, right? Because that robot kind of changes the idea that the architect just needs to draw the plan, and then the plan gets notated and it gets sent to people to build. In this case, the architect, everything changes because the architect will directly program the robot and the robot will build. So this is a kind of a more, in a way you could argue, a more fundamental shift for it. It actually disrupts the way that architects engage in a way with the world. So that seems a kind of more fundamental shift. Not to say that this robot could not obviously also stack bricks with AI or machine learned input as well. Right? It's just about kind of the specific work focusing on GANs. And for me, the kind of the work with, especially this kind of fascination with, the 90s, with the kind of the Garys and the kind of architects from the 90s is extremely funny, especially because Gary, famously Gary did designs with this almost kind of found objects or accidental objects, right? The kind of the paper crumb or the kind of the loosely built form. And then you can really also ask the kind of the question like what is more efficient, right? Is it more efficient to kind of feed, 3,000 images through a GAN, or would you just, take a piece of paper and crumble it? Who's being smarter here, right? And especially it's also so funny and ironic for me that if you think about in the case of Gary, right? He needs do you really need AI to understand what's happening here? Like he's crumbling, a piece of paper, he's looking at the beauty in a kind of a folded cloth, right? It's not a secret. It's like, and there's, if you talk about intelligence, there's probably little intelligence in the act itself, right? There's a lot of beauty in it, a lot of creativity, and a lot of kind of daring, but it's extremely kind of funny that you would want to recreate this act. So that also raises the next question, which is a more fundamental one maybe as well. Like how much intelligence do you actually need for architecture, right? Do you need, like to what degree, what amount of intelligence do you need for architecture? And again, like that's not to say that we shouldn't use AI or machine learning. I totally agree with Neil. It's one of the most interesting things. And my students are working with that, and we're all very fascinated by it. But the question is, we need to ask critical questions, right? Like does architecture get better if you throw a lot of AI at it, for example? And also, like how much intelligence and creativity do you need, right? This is kind of London generic. Like this is kind of what is being built everywhere in London. And I would argue that it doesn't require that much intelligence, right? Like you would probably be able to kind of, to generate a building like this as well. You could do it pretty quickly without needing AI for that, right? And like this is the market standard. And there's also kind of an interesting relationship in a way between, intelligence and architecture. Like famously, I'm always fascinated in a way by how difficult Peter Eisenman made architecture sound like. Like it's kind of this extremely difficult and complicated regime, right? And then you kind of, in the end, if you look at buildings like Santiago de Compostela, which is one of the most probably critiqued and bashed buildings when it finally opened, it was clear that someone had thought too much about it, right? He had been looking too far. Like it's not, like very often intelligence and architecture actually kind of oppose to each other. Like the more you think about it, the worse the building gets, right? And, again, talking about Gary, right, who just crumbled a paper bag. And like, this is like a very complex layering of all kinds of axes and whatever, and like incomprehensible, complicated, hyper intelligent construct. And in the end, it fails, right? And if you're interested in that, there are these beautiful debates online between, like, there's a number of them actually, iteratively between Jacques Herzog and Peter Eisenman. Peter Eisenman famously as someone who believes in theory, and Jacques Herzog as someone who doesn't believe in theory, right? Just in practice. And he doesn't even, it's just like, well, it is what it is. This building is that building. And he's literally telling Peter, like, writing books about architecture makes no sense, right? And again, like very often, I think architecture thrives on the lack of intelligence, right? Like, some of the most successful practices today are so successful just because they manage to kind of present things in the simplest possible way, right? And like, that's not to say, like, I love this specific scheme by Dick. I think that's a very intelligent scheme, actually. But it's also extremely, extremely blunt and simple, right? And maybe that's why it's so intelligent. But like, there's an interesting relationship with stupidity or a lack of intelligence and architecture, right? You can really ask this question, like, do we need computers to help us design? And again, also this one, which I'm always fascinated by, the Meson Domino, which is one of the most stupid yet most intelligent models in architecture. It's arguably the most successful model for architecture ever. It consists of 3 floor plates, what is that? Like a number of columns, a staircase, super, super simple, right? And super stupid in a way, but it's also really genius in the way that it has conquered the world, right? So this is kind of like whatever we do always kind of hits back at this model, and it's kind of blunt stupidity. And again, if we actually look today at like the newest kind of timber technologies like CLT, I mean, that's how you build with CLT. And like, these are even quite subtle ways of building with CLT. You can even build, in more stupid ways. Like that's the kind of the stupid reality in a way of construction, which at the same time is, I mean, super interesting to work with. Right? Like this is a mass plywood panel. You could literally build buildings like this today, right? Like these are just basically chunks of timber with, very, very simple, right? So it's really interesting when we look at the way that things are automated, that we look at new automated platforms, that they all rely on this kind of really blunt, rigorous, or in a way, you could say kind of stupid methods, right? So like, for example, Katedry as well, right? Kind of the almost modernist library of parts. And I think really that kind of intelligence in architecture shows in the kind of starts from the understanding of this kind of blunt and simple processes. Like this is the work of Ensemble Studio, which I'm really a big fan of. If you don't know it, you should check it out. Like these are kind of, just basically he dug a hole in the ground, put some plastic board, some concrete, and that's it, right? Like that is for me kind of like really architectural intelligence. Or this one as well, a kind of a stacking of prefabricated, recycled concrete beams that were for sale, right? And you stack those together, you have a house. Like that is kind of cunning architectural intelligence, while it's also kind of, super, super blunt. And then it's no surprise that until now it's also establishing his own tech company that thrives on this kind of understanding of that simple way of working. So yeah, I think the kind of most interesting ideas come from architects who ask those kind of like fundamental questions about how can we build, right, from beginning to end. For example, WikiHouse, who asked a simple question: what if we could build a house with just one machine, with a CNC machine, and then plays out the consequences, right? Or like Frank Lloyd Wright, who like by designing, I mean, like this is one of the precedents of the discrete, of course, but like by designing the textile block, an entire kind of new way of constructing architecture emerges, right? And again, like if you look at companies like Katedry, if you're not familiar with Katedry, it's a SoftBank-funded multinational company in the US that is attempting to revolutionize construction. And for me, they ask the kind of really interesting questions in a way about automation and artificial intelligence and design, where they basically trying to investigate the supply chain, right? So that question like, what is an architect doing? Who makes decisions about what to build? When does an engineer come in? What gets automated, et cetera, et cetera. And like these are the kind of the key, the kind of fundamental questions. And on that note, I actually agree with Neil when he said that, the way that AI materializes itself is not, shouldn't actually, in its most powerful way, it's not actually something formal, right? It's all about the logistics, like the way that Uber operates or the way that Katedry operates, right? So what they're doing is reinvestigating the logistics of construction. So in a way, you could make this statement, this is a kind of a simple diagram that, before, I would say, the financial crisis of 2008, you have the kind of the deconstructivist biometricist work, which has an obsession of the digital with form. And after 2008, the most interesting work is work that is obsessed with platforms, that is obsessed with the distribution and the logistics of architecture, which doesn't mean that there is no form. I mean, architecture always has a form, but the emphasis is more on the platform. And that is kind of where you find, I think, the most interesting work. So this brings us to this famous image of Lee Sedol, right, who was beaten by AlphaGo. And like to apply kind of, the conversation that we just had, right, to this kind of very special moment You could kind of look at it that in a way, what is interesting about this is the game itself, right? The game of Go. And the game of Go, I mean, it has been analyzed by Reiser Uemoto at the Atlas of Novel Tectonics and been compared to chess also, right? Because so they're saying chess is basically a hierarchical game, which relies on symbolic meaning. It has a limited set of connection possibilities, etc. And they compare that with, for example, with classical architecture. Whereas Go is a game that is much more computational, which is why it was so interesting to throw AlphaGo at it, why it was so difficult to automate it, right? Because it's based on this kind of very fundamental particles, and that then generates essentially kind of an insane amount of possibilities for the game to be played. And that kind of, you can look at that in an architectural way, right? You could say, well, I mean, what kind of game do we want to play in architecture? Do you want to play chess or do you want to play Go? Like that is the interesting question. And then of course you can play a game with an AI or with an automated process. But first the question is like, what kind of game do we want to play? And that is the kind of, I think, where the architect really comes in, right? I mean, the architect is the one that designs the game. Our job is designing the game Go. Our job is not playing the game Go. The game Go is being played, right? In the construction industry, I mean, the game Go, if you make the equivalent to architecture, currently is the Meson Domino with its kind of global supply chain and its kind of globalized, capitalized, commodified construction world that is around it. That's the game that is being played. But our kind of job, especially as researcher architects, is to change the game, right? We set up our own game, and we want to set up a game that can be played by multiple actors and that is made to be played by, robots, automation, AIs. We don't want to play chess with AlphaGo, right? We want to play Go with AlphaGo. And currently, with the kind of, if you don't change the way that the construction industry and architecture works first, before looking at an AI, there's no need for an AI currently in architecture. Architecture doesn't need that level of intelligence. But we could set up a system that actually requires that, right? And that then kind of gives rise to a much more interesting game to play. And that's kind of the beauty here, the connection possibilities between like chess and Go. That Go kind of generates this like insane amount of different avenues and possibilities. So our mission as architects is to invent games, right? The games that we want to play. What kind of game do we want to play? And in answering that question, you're taking a position on architecture and you produce this course, right? And it all also links to the questions that you want to ask for your game. And I'm very, I think, clear on that, is that I don't think that this is the game anymore. Like that game has been played, and it was played until the financial crisis of 2008. It's still being played by a few corporate giants that we as little architects can never compete with. Let them play that game. I mean, you will not enter that game anyway. We need to kind of ask very different questions, right? In response to what is actually happening in the world right now. And we are confronted, I think, since 2008 with a kind of, we're living in a kind of unbelievably interesting time. We're confronted with a number of radical crises, from the climate crisis to the crisis of automated labor that is imposed on us, to the way that digital platforms are manifesting themselves in the world, to the way that, utopias are being colonized by, Elon Musk and Bin Salman and Jeff Bezos, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to kind of, we need to, I think that there's a clear, and I'm not the only one saying that this game is not relevant anymore. Right? And so the game that is, I think, that is defining kind of, across in a way, this kind of images of the context that we operate in, is in a way automation, right? Like we could really talk about, from a much larger meta perspective, we could really kind of make a simple dialectic that, modern architecture came into being during mechanization. The idea, mechanization takes command by Siegfried Gideon, with, the kind of ideas about labor and work. Famously, the Ford factory paid its employees enough so that they could become customers of the Ford factory and buy their own car. Now that model has been replaced today by, probably the Amazon warehouse as the quintessential example of automation or digital production. Like that's actually, I think this image is the defining HIH of digital production. You don't see any robots, you don't see any people. This is also the moment that, labor, that, if you work in the Amazon warehouse, you become a gig worker. You don't become someone who could put, a very different status than the Ford factory, right? So we wrote this book about it. If you want to read more about, how basically we can think about automation in architecture, and how we can look at robots not just as kind of innocent, not just as something innocent, but as something that is always enmeshed in a network of politics and with social consequences. And of course, this is also, of course, where the discrete comes in. So the discrete is not, it is not a style. It is something that has a lot of stylistic features, for sure, that is maybe recognizable. But fundamentally, it's a position on architecture. It's a kind of a position in acknowledging that there are a series of different questions that we need to ask. That the kind of obsession with continuous form in a political vacuum that is over, right? So what the discrete really tries to do is to kind of kickstart a new project for digital technologies in the age of automation, right? Understanding that digital technologies are not politically neutral, that there are always social and political consequences to it, and kind of questioning how we can make this really, how we can really benefit from these ideas of the digital. And of course, like the discrete, I mean, like this book, ultimately, I think every book is always a retroactive manifesto. So this book was published in 2019, but then was written in 2018 with work that was done between 2015 and 2017. So in a way, it's very interesting how obviously books always lag behind, right? If we kind of fast forward to today, we see that kind of the discrete as a movement that did have a kind of an impact, maybe accelerated by the publication of the book. But these days, for example, the algorithms of Pinterest are relatively good at understanding what the discrete is. Of course, from a kind of purely stylistic level, in this case, they don't look at the kind of the politics behind it. But anyway, like now there's kind of a larger community, I think, worldwide working on this. Also now with also here, right, with Monoceros, which is a software built here by Jan. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, of course, there was also WASP by Andrea Rossi, which I think caused a major impact, because suddenly a lot of people were, not only able to read about the discrete, but they were also able to kind of build their own designs. And I'm seeing the same happen probably with Monoceros and a series of other plugins also that are out there. So anyway, so this is kind of like, just kind of meta perspective on the kind of context in a way for the discrete, or a way that I think we should, as architects, question technologies and think about it. And now I want to briefly run you through a bit more in depth about like what the discrete actually is, or how we're thinking about that today. So first of all, I think, so the discrete is really a position on the digital. It's a position taken by a generation of architects, researchers, theorists, designers, historians. There are no rules. It's not like in parametricism that there is a kind of a holy Bible that you need to read that is written by a kind of a founder. Like, it's very open, and it's a continuous debate as well about what it is, right? It's not like, I mean, there are many, many different texts, and I probably on many fronts disagree with some of my colleagues who also, would be categorized as part of the discrete. There's always a lot of vivid debates about everyone's position. And, if you're interested in that body of work, you're obviously also encouraged to, in a way, take your own position and try to contribute something to those debates, right? And I think that, like, that is actually what a movement is, that is, not retroactive, but that is actually alive. So this position on the digital, I think, I mean, I'm mainly going to talk now from my perspective, is architectural. It's an architectural position, it's technical, and it's also socio-political. And I think you always need all three if you want to do architectural discourse. You can't get away with one of them, right? If you just do technical work, you're missing an opportunity. So I will actually start with the one that is maybe most whimsical, or that is not always like talked about deliberately. And I think also the one that I contributed a lot to with my work, which is the architectural position, right? Which is, I would call the possibility of a discrete architecture. And that's kind of the very simple question, right? Like, could we imagine an architecture that is not derived from the whole, but that only consists of generic parts that have no function and no form? And that those generic parts that we just, there's no floor slabs, there's no columns, there's no predefined types. It's just basically voxel-like, generic, Lego block-like elements that are not hierarchically different, and that we put those together. What happens to architecture when we do that? What are the qualities of that kind of architecture? And you can consider this question, almost as a purely creative question. Right? And it's a very important one, because obviously we have thought about the digital always from overall form. We have never thought about it from its basic parts. We have never asked the question upside down, if you want. So it's also, I think, an important question that we ask this question. We need to entertain that question. Otherwise, we haven't tried it out, right? It's kind of, it's out there and we need to do it, especially because architecture always has this kind of extremely interesting relationship between the discrete and the continuous. And of course, it's never that dialectic that it's either discrete or continuous. It's usually mixed. And there's also kind of a toroidal situation where if you're extremely discrete, you end up being continuous. And if you're extremely continuous, maybe you end up being discrete, et cetera, et cetera. Like, they are definitely always kind of enmeshed in each other. But there obviously is such thing as kind of, the building on the left by Felix Candela is obviously a continuous building because it's a single whole. It has no parts. It literally has one part, and that part is the building itself. Whereas then the building on the right by Aldo van Eyck, it's a building that is discrete. It's not a digital discrete. It's a very modernist building, which maintains hierarchies, but it's a building that has, consists of discrete parts that have been put together. And there's no, in a way, overarching form. It could keep growing or it could keep contracting. And so with the image on the left, we have obviously experimented in architecture. We have actively worked with that image. That was the early digital project. But with the image on the right, we have not, right? And there is an extreme opportunity, obviously, in thinking about the image on the right, because the image on the right already, even though it's not digital here, has properties that the image on the left doesn't have, right? You could also talk about, the fact that it's adaptable, that it's systemic, that it's prefabricated, that it establishes kind of a non-hierarchical democratic space, many, many opportunities there that are very interesting. And you could really also ask this question again, I'm coming back here with my colleague Ro, we have never been modern slides. You could also kind of ask this question and say like, well, we have never, we have never asked that question. Right? We have never really looked at it. And I made this kind of joke about it, that we have never been digital, because obviously you could also make the argument that, continuity is per definition always analog. It's a mechanical process where you don't have any discrete units, just the difference between an analog clock, which continuously interpolates, versus a digital clock, which works with discrete units. So that's kind of a definition of Claude Shannon between analog and digital signals, right? So if you take that to the letter, you could argue, and that's a bit of a joke, right? But you could argue that we have never been digital because we have never considered discreteness in digital design, which is also part of the argument that Mario Karpel advances, right? So again, one more reason in a way to investigate, well, what would it actually then be architecture if you look at it? And it's important though to draw the distinction with Breaking the Curve and Mario Karpel, because often people think that the discrete, as it's in my book, that it is a kind of a literal application in the way of the kind of the history that is sketched out in Breaking the Curve, but that's not actually true. Like in Breaking the Curve, there's actually, it's only about discreteness on the level of digital design. It doesn't involve fabrication, and that's crucial, right? It's like what the kind of body of work that was that really defines, I think, the discrete as a movement is the relationship between the digital design process and the fabrication process, that are essentially the same. So the work that Mario describes as discrete in Breaking the Curve is actually, in her opinion, or in my opinion, is not actually discrete, because it does use a discrete design process, but once it's fabricated, it goes back to a continuous fabrication process where things are being mass customized and milled. And it has this kind of idea of time as well, that things are always finite. Like this chair by Philip Morel, very beautiful, has a discrete design method maybe behind it. but and it looks kind of discrete, but it's actually not discrete in the sense that it's actually a continuous sculpture that looks voxelized in the way that it's built. If you built it from tiny little voxels that are assembled by robots, then it would maybe be discrete architecture. So this is kind of, the possibility of that architecture, right? And I think you also need to see that kind of in the context. And this is a kind of a terrible history diagram that I produced that, summarizes everything that has happened in architecture from 1915 to 2008. So we have obviously the domino modernism, the kind of the most intelligent and most stupid model that kind of governs the world. Then the postmodernist attempt to diffuse that domino and to say like, well, no, production is not actually that, and kind of try to hide the domino, but the domino is present, nothing changes in the way that it's produced. Then Peter Eisenman, who just makes it extremely expensive and complicated to build a domino by taking two dominoes and rotating them. And then the parametric project, which wraps the dominoes in plasterboard CNC milled panels to make it not look like a domino, but actually it still is a domino, but you will register the kind of the curved panelization of it. And then the triple O project, which was mainly popular in the US, where dominoes are made to look like objects that are, have their own life in the city. So if you really want to do something as a young architect, you need to it's very difficult to escape this scenario, right? So this is kind of, I think, the interesting provocation of the discrete is then that in this case, this is radically new compared to the previous ones. Not on a formal level, I deliberately drew this diagram in exactly the same shape as the domino, right? It doesn't actually kind of try to generate another kind of form because there is no more form, there's no more hall, it doesn't matter. What actually matters is how it's created, right? So what is radically different here is that this one doesn't rely on the domino. It's made of one part that happens in this case to be assembled in the shape of a domino. But this is the only one that is radically different from the domino. All the other ones are still the domino. So that is also to kind of say like the kind of, the fundamental shift there. And then especially if you begin to ask, because that model now on the right, then also gives you access to a lot of other questions, which I will discuss in the next chapters, which is basically, well, how are these things assembled? Which kind of platform is there? Who owns maybe that platform? Like it also immediately already talks about the kind of possibility to question the building industry. So that is then the kind of, the paradigm, you could say, of the discrete in relationship to the modern project and the continuous project. So obviously the modernist project had an affinity with parts, right? There are, it's not for no reason also resulted in an interest in prefabrication and housing, etc. So there is an interest in parts. However, these parts are hierarchical and they're always functional, right? They're always typological, like a column is always a column. The parts are not kind of generic computational bits and pieces. They have very specific functions. And through that, Colin Rowe's criticism that ultimately it's a classicist project. And then the continuous, which is a project that has no parts, but only consists of a whole. And obviously the continuous and the modern are dialectically opposed to each other. So the continuous is modernist times -1. It's a post-modern project that is all about difference and that tries to diffuse the parts. So if modernism is an assembly, then the continuous is not an assembly, right? And then the discrete, and that's actually the funny thing. So the discrete is not actually dialectically related to the continuous, nor to the modern. So it's not a post project. It's not post-modern or post-digital or post-continuous. It's actually a thing in itself because of its non-dialectical relationship to the modern and the continuous. So the discrete takes on board from modernism. I mean, first of all, the idea that architecture can actually, that it's important to consider kind of the societal repercussions of architecture, but also the idea of an assembly, an affinity kind of with prefabrication, etc. And then it takes on board from continuity the rejection of the universal, right? So the idea that there is not one building, that everyone is different, that every site is different, and that you cannot kind of presuppose a kind of a universal human being that you then design architecture for. Instead, everything is always unique and always customized. The difference is that this happens in the discrete through repeating parts, right? So the kind of modernist idea of seriality. So it has a kind of, I think, a very ambiguous and complex relationship that is not dialectic to the modern and continuous. So in that sense, it's also a continuation in the way of the digital project and not a rejection of it. Yeah, and then, I mean, this is obviously exploring the kind of, this question, the possibility of discrete architecture, like what are the kind of ramifications and the qualities of the architecture. And then the second one would be the technical logic of the discrete. So beyond the kind of the architectural questions, there's obviously also a technical logic and a technical premise. And I already spoke about the platform. I already spoke a bit about prefabrication. And the importance of that, which you probably all know, is that the construction industry has not increased productivity since 1947. It's still the least digitized industry in the world. 1947 is actually the year that Le Corbusier started building Unité d'habitation. So you could say that despite all the kind of BIM and new technologies that we have, that architecture has not actually radically changed since 1947, which again refers back to my history diagram I showed you before. And then, of course, there is this, a technical question, right? Like the technical research of discrete fabrication. So the robot on the left is a form of continuous and analog fabrication where you continuously extrude clay. So that 3D printing process there is an analog and continuous process, whereas the robot on the right is assembling repeating elements and can also undo those elements. So that is a discrete fabrication process. So that's kind of a technical project, which also kind of questions how robots are used today, and they're mainly used across the world to engage in continuous fabrication processes. They are either like cutting materials, they are weaving carbon, they are gluing bricks. So they're all kind of engaged in continuous processes. That is essentially what they're doing, all these robots. The daily job is to slice up predefined forms, forms that have been optimized, that have been designed, and then they cut those forms into slices, and then the slices get assembled into the original form. Whereas then, of course, the paradigm of discrete fabrication, is looking at that idea of recombinable units, fundamental units or voxels, and that takes inspiration of the work by Rob Lipson, but also Neil Gershenfeld at the Center for Bits and Atoms, which developed this kind of idea of digital materials, which are these repeating Lego-like building blocks that can be used to assemble larger varieties of features and structures, such as airplanes, but also river dams and satellites. And very importantly, their kind of argument of again, why this is a digital material is because it has discrete connections. It can only connect in a very specific way to another material. And because the problem space is so limited, it's very easy to optimize this for robotics. So you have this kind of robotic elements that can then use the parts that they assemble as kind of a landscape to maneuver. In reality, of course, this is a robot because it's still always very difficult to do. So in reality, it's obviously still kind of assembled by humans. But there are very interesting questions in relationships between, kind of technical questions about, for example, distributed robots, etc. And then I think most fundamentally to kind of look back at prefabrication and understand the kind of, if we look at prefabrication from a digital perspective, how can we do it better, right? How can we kind of prevent the construction of these homogeneous and repeating soulless buildings that are universal? And how can we kind of make use of the efficiencies of prefabrication? But when you think about it in a digital way, we will be able to kind of get rid of the universality that you see there, right? And that's also what's happening now currently with construction platforms like Katedra, which is actually very interesting. Like Katedra is actually essentially a modernist 1950s, 1960s prefabrication company, as we're present west and east of the Berlin Wall. The only difference is it's done in timber and it's managed by BIM and it's funded by venture capital. But it's essentially kind of the same thing as a Soviet house builder with a very long production chain, centralized factories, but funded with venture capital. So the question is really like, if we, when we look at prefabrication from a digital perspective, that we could kind of really, that we could really start an entirely new project of prefabrication, right? And that in doing that, we could get rid of this kind of hyper complicated way that architecture is assembled today. So that's kind of the technical question, right? The technical question would be, can we build buildings from self-similar repeating elements that are versatile and end up with fully functional elements? And in doing that, can we revisit this whole production chain and hopefully then make it more accessible, right? So this is kind of this opposition, of the question, like if you look at the digital materials that Gershenfeld and the Center for Bits and Atoms created. In my own work, I kind of try to scale those things up. So they're also, my own elements are also based on 2D sheet materials that are cut and folded into generic elements and that then can be assembled and reassembled into a variety of buildings. So this has been also kind of explored through all these installations. And then the last topic that is important is the political position. The politics of automation is basically the kind of questioning of the platforms that would be distributing those parts and the ownership that is present in there. So I've written also a number of articles on this kind of questioning, also the kind of politics just generally behind digital fabrication. Like this is an article I wrote about prepper culture and self-builders and fab labs, and kind of generally trying to understand that automation and robots, that they're always embedded in and entangled in political and social questions, right? And that it's very crucial to kind of to question the platforms that will be emerging from automation, like Katedry. And then, anyway, so like we explored that with our students, these questions. So playing around with robots, questioning the kind of the platforms that govern those robots and the projects that they build. So we mainly looked at housing and kind of tried to ask questions of like how robots can help us deliver more interesting, more accessible, more sustainable forms of housing. And I won't talk so much about the student work in this talk. And then just to kind of very briefly flip through then my own work of how we tried this out, kind of building this pavilion in Tallinn in 2017, which was really exploring these discrete elements, the assembly of those discrete parts, and like kind of exploring in this case, again, like the kind of the mixture of the architectural questions, the political and social questions, and the technical questions, right? So, and then this also carried on with this one in the Royal Academy, where we built a section of this house. And then, again, like most importantly, always kind of questioning housing, right? Like how we could build housing in a different way with these platforms. And now recently we've just completed this project back in Belgium, which is kind of a small, a very small typical house extension. So it's essentially just a roof with 3 feet, like a timber table that stands between 2 walls. And this will be the kind of the first inhabitable, permanent, inhabitable discrete structure. It's a very humble program. It's very cheap to build this as well. So we clicked this together, these blocks, in 4 or 5 days before Christmas last year, all prefabricated offsite and then brought to the site, and just kind of gradually started assembling these building elements, and then resulted in this, which, I mean, again, for me, is kind of insane, right? Like this is a house extension with a tiny program. Like normally with the kind of, the budget for these kind of things, you would get a plasterboard ceiling with like a few spotlights in it, right? But this kind of like for me, it's kind of a very beautiful way to show how the arguments of the discrete kind of enable, like what they enable, right? The fact that we could build these things in an affordable way, the fact that we don't need to kind of give up on architecture, it's still hedonistic, it's still slightly excessive, it has all this kind of, I think, incredible aesthetic qualities, yet it is also a project that is efficient in a way, right? And that kind of maximizes these questions of how we can produce more with less. So this is not a kind of a kind of Star Architect Gary project in that sense, right? Like this is something that is, I mean, I wouldn't say like austere, because it's obviously visually quite excessive, but the kind of the basis of it is very conscious, basically, about labor, about work, about cost, etc., etc. And again, with the idea that, this is just one instance. It's not unique. Like we can build with the same blocks, we could build hundreds of these ones that in every instance would be different. I also like it because, again, it's slightly primitive, right? It's definitely related to my domino diagram as well. Like it's kind of doing the kind of most fundamental move you can do as an architect, constructing a vertical and horizontal plane, right? And and it's deeply primitive, right? In a way, what it does is kind of, rather than building with material, with trunks from the forest, it basically builds with timber sheets that are directly sourced from the forest and then assembled into these repeating building blocks. So that's just kind of like the statement that automation does not result in some kind of like far-fetched, hyperbolic, utopian future where we all wear latex suits and walk around in spaceships. And that is deeply alienating, but instead we're kind of, in a way, able to, maybe work a bit closer to nature, work a bit more in a kind of, in a kind of continuity also with a certain history, right? So in a way, like these things are kind of primitive. And I think that that's also the beauty that they are so primitive. Right? It's kind of, they're stripped of all these kind of layers of history. So that means that the really old and the really new are very similar, right? As we see in this diagram. And that's kind of a quality I think that you see in all these things, that they're like kind of futuristic and primitive at the same time. We'll skip this. Yeah, I mean, I just want to also kind of say that quality, you find that quality of these repeating elements also in the kind of earlier work. So work that I was showing here in Prague back in 2014 for the first time was also kind of, that's like going back in time, but it also had the kind of the same quality of this kind of singular material organizations, like a single bit that kept on repeating. That's this kind of affinity in a way with, I would say, with kind of minimalist art, right? With this kind of insane repetition of similar elements. And of course, the elements back then, they were not, they were discrete in the sense that there is a unit that is repeating, but they obviously had a bit of flex in that unit, and they were not so constrained as in the work we're doing now, right? So like, there is an idea about parts in this project, but the parts have quite a bit of freedom and flexibility to assemble together. But I think the kind of fundamental qualities are the same in this work. And then the questions of scaling this up, I think, is also important. So like, how do you scale it up beyond kind of the small projects? I always kind of do those competitions to try out if you can compete with big practices. So this was a concert hall in Nuremberg, which is completely built of repeating V-shaped elements that are constructed out of CLT. And again, I think this is quite a radical project. It's just a glass box. It's literally a box. But at the same time, it's not a glass box. And it actually has nothing in common with any other building built before. The entire building is cut. It's built with the same building block. So it's all the same CLT sheets. There are no columns, there are no beams. There's not a single element that you recognize from a normal building, except the staircase, of course. It's quite funny that, of course, we were willing to compromise a bit to win the competition. So we were like, yeah, sure, the timber sheets on the top floor of the building will be, will have a kind of a different dimension than the ones at the bottom, because the ones at the bottom are carrying much more load. But then our engineers, which was Bollinger Grohmann, stipulated that actually because of fire regulations, the timber had to be the same dimension at the bottom and at the top of the building, because the fire regulations override the structural concerns. So again, I think it's quite amazing that the whole building again is kind of primitive, almost organic. You could say it's a continuous space actually, although it's made of discrete parts, but it's actually continuous in the sense that it's a continuous operation of the same material everywhere. And again, there's no difference between the wall, the ceiling, etc. And I think the most radical aspect of the building is that literally everything, a part of the facade, a part of this like 20, 30 centimeters at the edge of the building, everything else is digitally manufactured. Everything else is just cut with a robot and brought to site and assembled. So the most radical thing of this building is that it just dismisses the entire kind of construction industry, right? The only thing that it does is basically, you go to the forest, make some CLT sheets, cut those CLT sheets, and assemble it into a building, which is really radical, right? Like if you compare this, this is, if you compare this to the current state of architecture, where we have become a millimeter thin superficial profession that is just hanging, in a way, plasterboard ceilings under pre-existing roofs, right? That's a kind of job, like just kind of decorating something that is defined not by us. So what it does, this project, is reintroduce a kind of a monolithic architecture, right? Where we actually, again, become a spatial profession that we can expand kind of, or impact, right? So it gets rid of this, the provocation by Rem at the Venice Biennale, right? Where architects are just doing that plasterboard surface under this stack. And then, in a way, the primitive aspect is, what is above the ceiling, right? Kind of gilded dome. But it gets rid of this kind of commodified, globalized building industry. So I've been doing that for a number of other competitions. Like this is a series of primitive barns that I've been doing, or sheds or huts that are made of, again, like these repeating elements. These are just like 21 millimeter thin LVL sheets in this case. This was a project done with Door van Weert Architecten in Belgium. And it's also like an extremely cheap building for the budget. Like this is kind of architecture on a budget. And I like that it's just a shed, like it's deeply uncreative, right? It's just kind of taking this kind of, it's like almost forbidden, right? Like you're like the worst architect if you kind of like do a building with a gabled roof. I hope banal can you be, right? But it does exactly that. And in the process of doing it, the roof that results from this has nothing in common anymore with the banal roof, right? Like you can say kind of what you want. It maybe looks like a roof, but it's absolutely not a gabled roof, right? It has nothing in common. Nothing, again, in this building is something that you would know from a traditional roof. And you can do that on any resolution, right? Like these are also kind of works with very simple parts. Like this is still, I would say, a digital, fully automated architecture. Right? It's just kind of a stack of blocks, just on a lower resolution with a bit less freedom, but it's exactly the same system, right? Which kind of resembles a bit this Frank Lloyd Wright version built with Lego blocks. And then I want to end this quickly by saying, so, this was the work I was doing with my own practice. We recently also launched a spin out from our research lab at the Bartlett, which is a tech company. It's called AUAR, Automated Architecture, which wants to build a platform that is based on this very simple building block, just a square building block, that is very, very generic, with the idea that much more people could interact with it. So not just kind of one architect, as in my own practice, which is, very authored and obsessive and not open source and not to be copied by anyone. But AUAR is very different. AUAR is kind of, it kind of opens up a space for participation, a space also for kind of non-human agency, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is that with a simple building block, you'll be able to create housing, radically different housing, despite it being such a simple building block. We are developing the robots that are assembling these blocks. We built our own office with this. We are building this kind of softwares that allow non-architects to interact with these systems and to design alongside us and to kind of get their hands on automation. So we're working with all these kind of communities that are in need of housing and think with them together about how we could produce housing. So it's really kind of a tech platform, but obviously very different from Katedry or Sidewalk Labs, in the idea that, first of all, the system is very open, can result in a huge amount of difference, but also in the idea of how it interacts with communities, with the idea that it really wants to kind of put people at the heart of this process of automation and bring them in touch with automation. And the ultimate goal of the startup is obviously to produce large-scale housing. We've already done a few proposals on this, and we just now recently finished building the project that is the poster for today in Hackney, which is like a two-story prototype that we built together with Hackney Council, which is basically, it's a little house, and it wants to kind of raise discussions about housing and about how we could build housing very differently the moment that we have set up a discrete production chain, that it would open up a very different relationship with housing. And this building, again, will be is now for sale also. So you can get those blocks, you can buy a number of blocks, and then they will be reassembled into someone's home. So that could be a house extension or a self-standing house. Like maybe it could be this one, like it's a small house extension somewhere that we'll work with. So yeah, I'll keep it there, and I would be really pleased, of course, to discuss with you guys the premises of the discretes. First of all, because some of you are working on this as well, so I'd be very curious about your thoughts and what you could add to this. And I also think for me, it also kind of raises this question of like, now that we're 2 years after, the publication of this issue, that it's almost time again to do a little new debate or a new symposium to kind of check what has happened in the meanwhile, right? And then how this is being absorbed, what the new thoughts are, etc., etc. So thank you so much, and open for questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very smart yet very entertaining lecture. I was laughing most of the time because, yeah, I really love that you used a lot of architectural references. It made it very theoretical. You were theorizing a lot, but at the same time, it was very personal and very open and honest, and that made it super entertaining. Yeah, so thank you about that. It makes the whole topic very accessible, I would say. So yeah, let's open the discussion, and the first question comes from Shota. And before Shota asks his question, I would like to ask Shota, did you appear on one of the pictures that Gilles was showing?
Which picture?
Maybe if I were, I missed it. I haven't noticed.
It was about the Akim Menges pavilion, and I think Shota was on one of those pictures.
Ah, okay, cool.
Oh yeah, probably I was documenting it, so I was often in the pictures. Thank you, Gilles. Very interesting lecture, and looking forward for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to have a question regarding what you actually started with. There was this interesting parallel between digital works, digital architecture, and late modern, post-war modern architecture. If we talk about the first digital turn in Mario Karpa's terms, then between all those kind of very generatively designed forms and then work of material computation, people like Heinz Isler and Frei Otto and Nervi and so on. And if we talk about the second digital turn, about the discrete, then there is this certain parallel to all the experiments of 60s, 70s with prefab, which were universal in both in the West and in the East, everywhere. However, of course, it's early days for the digital, but still, I think already now we can say that these digital experiments have kind of harder time to coming into the mainstream than the post-war modernist experiments. So my question is, do you think it's the difference is that our era is much more pragmatic and much more kind of careful about experimenting, or there is some kind of inherent technological difference or this reliance on the computers, which kind of makes it harder for society or for public to accept those experiments and becoming mainstream?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I would argue maybe first from the context. I think the context is extremely different between post-war, like early post-war era, and today. Like early post-war, there was, I mean, first of all, an incredible need for new buildings to reconstruct the world after the Second World War. There was also an arms race with prefabricated concrete between the East and the West, where both had to try to house as many people as possible, right? And Rainier de Graaf from OMA has written beautifully about this, how on both sides of the wall, there was a competition to create as much housing as possible. And they were actually exactly the same models, right? Both prefabricated concrete housing models. So there was really kind of, I think, a very different climate, of course, in terms of building. And the kind of the huge building sprints that have happened recently, because of course the world is building now more than it ever has, but that mainly happens in the East, right? That happens in like in China, in developing and emerging economies. And there, I think it's very much really at the hands of kind of a very advanced capitalism, right? Where it's essentially kind of very developer driven. And I think the world maybe has lost that kind of naivety that maybe was there just after the, you know, when early modernism started, you know, kind of a belief in architecture's capacity. And I think that it's now kind of just a purely kind of, you know, a purely kind of, and an endeavor that is just kind of driven by money. But this maybe sounds very pessimistic, and I do think there is like a great moment for architecture today. It's probably never been a greater moment, because I think we have incredible technologies that we can work with, and there's an incredible need to completely reinvestigate how we build because of the climate crisis. Like we just cannot keep building as we are building today. And the United Nations has these like numbers, the statistics. They're saying we need to build 2.1 billion homes in the next few decades. And if we build those homes basically in the way that we have been building them, we will basically kind of destroy our planet, right? So there is really an urgent need to redefine how we build. And I think you are seeing actually from, you know, new startups and new tech companies that they are actually asking that question. Funny enough, architects are still not asking that question enough, I think. I think it's really up to us to kind of, you know, at least intellectually begin to again talk about, you know, things like housing, big visions on the construction industry, and that we need to be a bit more daring in that, because I think we're not kind of putting out those visions. Like if you look at, like you studied in Stuttgart, for example, I understood. I mean, it's obviously, I mean, it's super interesting work that is happening there. And also in other architecture schools, but still maybe, you know, it's also very polite in the sense that it doesn't want to be applied yet, right? It's not yet going for like, oh, we can, you know, change the way we build housing, or we can do this. No, it's like much more kind of polite and staying back, while at the same time, you know, other actors are saying that they can change the way that we build, and they're not per se architects, and they're not per se driven by, you know, by very good concerns, right? So, so that's a long-winded answer, maybe, Shota, to your question, which is both pessimistic and optimistic, I think.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree, and I also feel that maybe we actually have bigger or better tools, or there was more progress with tools right now than in the post-war era, but we lack that drive which was there.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just the politics changed a lot, right? But I mean, we can also kind of question if that's, you know, it all, you know, like things also change. You know, will keep changing, and I think like if we're looking at the crisis that is ahead of us, like the, you know, climate crisis, but also like a housing crisis and a crisis of automated labor, I think there will be. I do see it optimistic that there's more and more desire and need for a different way to build buildings.
I will continue on that question, unless somebody else has a question. And I would like to encourage everybody to ask the questions also on Facebook. We already have one on Facebook, but we will continue there right after. So I think what I want to ask is somehow related. And most of the, when you were speaking about mainly AUAR, but also about the discrete in general, your argumentation was very, aside of other things, it was very rational. It made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense in economical sense, and also any optimization you basically look at, even the labor and environmental responsibility. But my question would be, do you talk to the industry? Do you talk to property developers, to construction companies? Do they understand? What is their feedback?
Yeah, so I mean, recently, of course, when we're doing now that we're doing the tech company, we are reaching out quite a bit to developers and industry. And there are kind of, I mean, I would say generally the industry is quite receptive of the possibility. They're of course, like for them, it's also very new and they're like, really, could that be possible? Can we look at it in this way? But the kind of feedback that I got from industry until now on the things we're doing with our, and also the small projects that I've built myself is usually very interested, right? But the question is always like, I mean, it's very difficult because obviously I think there's a danger in these discrete systems that, you know, they just as maybe, like the dangers that they could also fall in the wrong hands, right? Like they could easily be used with a very different political idea in mind as well. I mean, in a positive way, you could then argue that then maybe we still have beautiful architecture as a result of that, but it might not be accessible and it might not be as distributed and kind of democratic as we hope it would be, right? So that's a kind of quite an interesting challenge. I think it's for the discrete moment that it would scale up and it would enter industry. Does it actually change the industry, or does it just become another, a very efficient building method to deal with adaptation, maybe for the building industry, but stripped of its kind of interest,
right? Is there any question on Zoom? Otherwise, I'm going to read the question from Facebook. So let's read the question.
Please go to Facebook, please.
Yeah. Okay. Michaela Tomashkova asked, is there any possibility to reassemble your structures once they have been built, or how open is the system you are proposing regarding the building's users?
Yeah, so they are, I mean, they're always, I didn't spend too much time talking about that, but they are discretely assembled, meaning that you don't craft the connections, but they just basically put together under tension. You just have a tension rod that compresses two parts together, which means that you can just unbolt the entire structure again. So like the one that you're using for the poster, the one we just recently built, like that one we will really reassemble into a number of other small buildings in the neighborhoods with the local community. And also like, the installations that I've built before are reassemblable. The experience though always proves that it's very difficult to find an opportunity to assemble them again. So that is a bit challenging. And then of course there's also the question, like some of them, I mean, it's interesting in terms of like circular economy and circular design that you could easily kind of disassemble them. But of course, projects like the house extension I just showed you, we don't necessarily want to disassemble that one, right? I mean, we've put in quite a bit of effort. So that obviously has a kind of a time scale of, hopefully living on for many, many years before that would be changed. But, with the work with our, we're definitely looking at kind of the life cycle of those parts, at the possibility to track kind of their life. Like maybe they've been serving as a kind of a diligent block in this building for X number of weeks. And then when we reassemble it, maybe that block becomes a piece of furniture and we can kind of like basically track who has built it, what functions, where was it in the building, and what is it doing now.
Veronica wants to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for amazing lecture. It was great, really. And I would like to ask, maybe I would like to kind of elaborate on what Jan was asking, but not just about, my question wouldn't be just about construction, but more about regulations. And when you were talking about one of your last projects in your presentation, there was your notion, or you said something like about the thickness of the plates on the upper floor that you were consulting with the engineers, and due to the regulations, you could like leave them. But I was then thinking like, because you are creating like novel type of thinking and architecture and you know all the philosophy behind it, but while you are constructing these spaces and elaborating your thinking, you still when you have to build something, you still have to go with old regulations, which are, in my opinion, sometimes old school and kind of they fit the architecture which you were describing in the beginning of your presentation. So my question would be, do you see a potential of your way of thinking in order to improve the building regulations? And if there will be new regulations, how does it compare to your philosophy? Like, will it be democratic space for building or architecture, or where the new regulations could possibly in the political way? I hope my question makes sense.
No, it's a super interesting question, I think. So, I mean, maybe first a very kind of pragmatic answer. So when I do competitions, I obviously have to work with all the existing building regulations, especially if you do competitions in Germany. There's no way you can, try to make them think outside of the regulations. So like the concert hall and, the larger projects, they are all done with technologies that really exist today. They're not experimental in that sense. Otherwise, you could not do the competition basically. However, the work that I'm building myself, like the house extension, then there are not that many regulations that apply to a private house, right? So in that sense, we've used this post-tensioned building system that I developed, and that is legally, you can't use that for public buildings because it legally doesn't exist. It has never been tested or validated by engineers. I mean, it has been tested, it has been calculated by my engineer, but there's no building code describing the system because it does not exist. So that is obviously a hurdle for some of the small scale work that we're doing, that if you want to be as radical as that kind of work, you would need to do quite a bit of studies and reports and collaborations with engineers to do that. Now, the more interesting part about your question is about how the systems could change regulations, right? And I think that is really interesting. Like, for example, the building that we just built, the 2-story housing prototype, if that building, you could argue, is because it's completely circular. So you could argue that it is actually doesn't need a building permit because it's always a construction site. It's never finished, right? There's no finished design. It always changes. You can always like move a block somewhere else. So that would mean that you don't need a building permit, for example, to build it. And it's only there temporarily. You can completely remove it again afterwards. That then again changes the relationship with land and with ground. So building, of course, in cities like London, but also, I mean, in all big cities in the world, is so expensive because it's, because of the price of the land, right, with the extrapolated value. But if you only use land temporarily, so if your building is only, can be taken away so quickly or can be adapted so quickly, your relationship to land also changes. And you could argue that, well, in London, there are like all these sites that are temporarily laying empty. We could completely continuously populate them with buildings that are, maybe stay up for like a year, maybe for 2 years, maybe sometimes for 10 years. So you could change the kind of the relationship to the ground, which is very interesting. So I think there are many repercussions that you could begin to think about in terms of regulations that could also be creative, right? That could kind of push the little politics of building.
Imre, please.
I always like on your presentations that you are always back and forth. You always confront yourself with a history, 20th century history. That was my biggest experience when we first met on 2015 on the symposium, that you were always talking according to the history of the modern movement, confront the nowadays with the history, with the past, and that's very, very challenging, and I appreciate that. And how you see nowadays situation, because comparing to the modern movement between towards the situation, seems to me that at that time, more intellectuals, more young people wish themselves to push to the modern, to the freshness, to the new ideas, and all those things. And nowadays, I see around that the upcoming generation, the young generation now, is very conservative generally, and I think the situation of discrete of that willingness is totally in different situation than almost 100 years ago. Am I wrong, or I'm too old that I'm so frustrated with because look at the Venice Biennale. Venice Biennale after Sejima is so uninteresting. God bless that we have kind of Tallinn Biennale, kind of new way platform for very little group of people trying to present globally what's going on in our profession. So, but generally, what do you think about that? How you do you see any solution? Do you see any strategy, PR, what to do? How to
we can probably debate this one for many hours, right? Because I think it's a very big question. I can try to kind of answer it just from my perspective, and you need to probably take it with a bit of salt. But anyway, I think I would agree with you that there's an incredible degree of maybe complacency and boring complacency in the current generation of young architects. That there is a kind of real fear of anything new, right? And I think that's a situation that is generated. Really, it's really for me, it all revolves around 2008. That's a magical number that the world completely changes, because everything before 2008 was going probably, as you remembered, Imro, with the kind of, the emergence of the star architects, the kind of very formal discourse, and honestly, optimistic experimentation. Right? I think that was the beauty of the early digital project, that it was so free and optimistic and truly experimental and kind of questioning lots of things. But of course, it didn't have a kind of, also because of the periods that it came into being, it didn't really have the kind of political or social consequence, right? Because it's the heydays of neoliberalism, everything is possible. You build big museums in Dubai and China, blah, blah, blah. And the world has no more real problems, right? It's supposedly there are no more real problems. Like there's no crisis, the climate is changing, we know it, but not that important. And there's like a little war here and there, but part of that is kind of Western hegemony. China is still, not on the radar. And it's just kind of, the world is just kind of, like a neoliberal kind of experiment, right? And I think 2008 rapidly stops that. And I think what you have is that there's a generation of architects that were educated with the kind of pre-2008 optimistic experimentation, who very rapidly realize that they have no chance with this game. Like they know they're operating in a very different time, a time of like austerity, of governments that are cutting expenses, of disbelief. It's not that optimistic anymore. So they obviously, they realize it's kind of the dream is over, right? They realize that kind of thing like the star architect is not going to work, and like the kind of formal, like they get all engaged in kind of trying to craft different responses to architecture. So what you see is the emergence of more like participatory practices like Assemble. You see people, trying to work around that kind of new austerity. And I think you can read the discrete also a bit in this way, is that we obviously all came out of digital experimentation, the AA, SciArc, and we still wanted to kind of do that optimistic, highly experimental project, but we changed the rules, right? Because we're working with, because there's no choice, I'm working with extremely cheap materials. It's very, like that thing behind me cost nothing, it's super cheap. Because there was no other option, right? We need to kind of work our way around these issues of austerity. And then it also introduced also these questions of like, that we need to consider like a political and social agenda for the digital. That like there's no way out. So I think like I would agree with you that there are probably a lot of people unfortunately got kind of lost in that climate of austerity and then became very complacent. But I do see, like, what I find interesting is that there is a lot of younger architects, you know, pushing the kind of boundaries of practice, like pushing what it means to be an architect, etc. And maybe it doesn't immediately have a kind of a formal output yet, or a kind of exciting spatial output. But you know, maybe that will come in a few years. But I think what they're doing now is, I would say, radical in the way that they try to redefine kind of our role as architects.
Why 2008? Sorry, I missed the point.
Financial crisis.
Ah.
It's a long time ago already. It's like
yeah, because that time Gregory obtained Gold Lion on when
he was the last one of that generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the end. Like after that, it's like all the biennales is like cheaper fits and yeah. But I mean, I also wonder, like, I mean, it's interesting to think about the parallel. Like, what would have happened, yeah, if that still kept going? Right? I mean, like, that's also an interesting question. Like, I mean, like architecture is so slow, right? We're just at the very beginning of playing around with digital technologies. Like, we still have years, decades to come to play around with it. So maybe, you know, we've seen the kind of early digital going up and then going down. Now we're seeing new modes of experimentation. And then, you know, from there, I mean, things will happen again, I think, in a few more years. But
yeah. 2 years ago, I had very interesting discussion with Greg Green, and I'm always pessimistic, and he's always, he mentioned himself that he's always optimistic, but he's optimistic in the way he removed from the architecture field to the design field. So that's why he's optimistic, because he found what he wants to do in the case of the work of design, but he's not dealing with architecture anymore. So
yeah.
But I see you as a person, as an optimistic person, so that's very positive.
I am very romantic and optimistic.
Okay, thank you.
Can we take more questions?
Sure. Just keep going. I'm happy to.
Okay. So there is Shimon and Jakub asking.
Hi. I first of all want to say that we really appreciate that we can talk with you. It's a nice opportunity. I want to elaborate more on the last question because it's very interesting. I wanted to ask you what you say. Now is the time when we can play in the decades. Maybe it's the future to come. What you see as the next step for the discrete architecture? Because you are proving that it's a real thing, not just a theoretical project. It's a real thing. What you see is the next step.
I think there are, I mean, as I just said to Imre, I'm a romantic and an optimist, right, in some sense. So like, I think there are kind of two exciting next steps, which, you know, actually take kind of also the shape of the two forms of practice that I have. So one is the tech company, one is the architecture practice. So I think the tech company trying to create alternative platforms for housing or building in general, I think is extremely exciting. And I'm really hoping that we will see a lot more architects doing this and initiating this kind of platforms, and that they will also start to kind of collaborate with each other, and that it will really kind of, you know, kind of really trying to change the way that we build. That's very exciting. And I think that that could be an interesting next step. And then in terms of my own practice, which is, you know, very different, of course, because my own practice is a kind of, you know, it's a very architectural endeavor, and it's, you know, it's not a tech company, right? It's kind of a traditional business model as an architect, which is obviously a bad business model. But what I think is the big danger with the discrete discourse is that it will not manage to escape the boutique practice. And like the boutique practice, I mean like the kind of the 5 to 10 people practice that maybe builds a few beautiful houses, but that doesn't manage to compete on the level of like an airport, a city, a concert hall, a big infrastructure project. Like that is really the challenge, because what you see today, and that's in general, you see today that architectural practice has stratified into boutique practice and commercial practice. So like Zaha now is obviously commercial practice, Foster's, Rogers, Stiller Scofidio, SOM, like they're kind of big practices that have multiple hundreds of employees that are able to operate on really big scale. And they started out as boutique, but they became really big. With this kind of unique situation between, let's say, 1990 and 2010. Right, that really scaled up architectural practice. So today the problem is with architects who came into practice after the financial crisis in 2008, or were not big yet by 2008, extremely difficult for them to scale and to become a non-boutique practice. So what you see is that you have a lot of architects who are doing extremely interesting work. Probably the best work today is happening in the format of boutique practice. It's critical, it's beautiful, it's interesting, but it cannot scale. It cannot scale to a large program. And it's played out in like little European houses and schools and like kind of small buildings. So the big question is like, how can a younger generation, not only the discrete generation, but also like other young architects, right? How can they scale up to avoid becoming kind of a boutique practice? Although, I mean, I would be really happy if I could already have a sustainable boutique practice. That would be a dream already, and it would already be a big achievement, which is also difficult in its own right. But once you are there, like, how can you actually do that, right? So that's why, I mean, I force myself now that I'm building, I'm building these like tiny projects with almost no budget for it, right? Like these house extensions. But at the same time, I also force myself to do a competition for, a train station or an airport or something that at least you can kind of say like, look, this is not, this has some possibility for scale. And I think as an architect, scale is really important. So that's, I think, something. My fear is that a lot of the discrete work would remain academic and small scale. And we need to kind of look at how we can prevent that from happening.
Speaking of the scale, I'm skipping the line now. Speaking of the scale, can you elaborate a little bit more on like the question? My question is, on which scale does the discrete happen? Because in most of the projects that you are showing, your own project, it seems like it's about this big, right? I mean, 1 meter big, the module, the discrete element. But yeah, in the examples that you were showing from the 60s, you were showing that the discrete module is as big as a house, maybe, or as a housing unit. So what? Where on which scale does the discrete happen?
Yeah, I think so. That's also, again, like, that's a super good question, right? It's very, very important. So, I mean, I again, like, maybe the pragmatic answer, what I have figured out is, I think, an ideal scale for the discrete element, which is the one I'm using, which is just kind of like, I mean, almost it's the size of the human body, basically, like the kind of roughly the same dimensions. And the reason is, I mean, it's purely whimsical and architectural. The reason is that those parts are always then very present, autonomous, and in a kind of a dialogue. They're never subjugated by the whole. You cannot unsee them because they are relatively large. So they are very, very present. They're in your face, and you will read whatever that they are assembled into. You always keep reading the parts. You're always like, well, I can see, how this is built. I can see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 parts, right? So like this is kind of, it works really well with that scale. There's obviously also other reasons, technical reasons for that scale. It's basically a sheet of plywood is 2 meters 40 by 1 meter 22, and every part is a sheet of plywood. So that's why also they have the scale, right? And then, but there are many kind of problems that emerge with scale. So basically my work has been decreasing in resolution, which means it has been increasing in scale. Like the larger projects I'm showing have very big parts. And the reason for that is just that that's the reality of prefabrication. It's like prefabrication with small parts is not an industry standard right now. Like it's very difficult to do. So the larger the parts, the cheaper the project, the more blunt it is. And as an architect, I'm interested in that as well. I'm interested how low can you go, right? How blunt can you be? Like how much can you kind of reduce? Like I like kind of walking that line where it's almost like there's almost nothing, but it's still there. Like I'm very interested. I've never been someone who's interested in the kind of the maximum. Like if you can do anything, I get a bit lost. I like to have a lot of constraints. Yeah, so large parts. So the funny thing is when I was doing the concert hall in Germany, for example, that's those parts are really large. But then after that, I was doing a Congress center in China. And like that building was 10 times the size of the concert hall. And so at that moment, my trick of making the parts relatively large stopped, because you cannot, even if you make a huge part, it's still tiny in comparison with the huge scale of the building. So the ultra large buildings really introduce, in the end up looking much more like my earlier work, like the early projects that I was showing, like Helsinki Guggenheim, where you have, parts that are in relation, again, become much smaller to the whole. And you do have more presence of the whole, just because you can't otherwise. So it's just like, at some point, there is kind of, like the whole becomes a bit more, becomes more present. And like, there's also, it's quite an interesting conversation. Like, for example, also what I learned from building the house extension, which I built myself, is that, the way that I'm building it is madness for prefabricators, like for professional contractors, because they would want to assemble just 4 really large parts inside. They don't want to assemble like thousands of small bits and pieces. So there is a kind of an argument to be made, like how we're thinking now about automation is that we would work with relatively, small parts, or the size that works, robotically pre-assemble them in the factory into larger chunks, and then move those larger chunks to the sites. Like that's kind of a paradigm that works. But it's funny. Also like the question of the scale is also interesting in terms of like, if your part becomes tiny, then you again need basically form as something to govern it. Like it wouldn't make sense to conceptualize it on a certain scale. So there is kind of definitely kind of a golden scale where things work, and at what moment do you need form again. Like if you look at bricks, for example, if you would use the scale of a brick, you will need a lot of overarching decision-making in order to design it.
Thank you. I got a message from Dan that he's got a question or two.
Yeah, thanks. Great lecture. Thank you. Also, I was very curious about this lecture, and was very looking forward to it. Although I wasn't, I'm quite a bit sad that you didn't cover that much of your 3D printing experiments, and all that branch was just chopped off and left on the ground, kind of. Because but I have some I've just like 2 little questions, and then one maybe speculation. First would be like, you said those elements are cheap, but like, can you put a price on one of these chunks? Can you like say our chunk costs $50, and one of those chunks behind you is like 200 or something?
Yeah.
And the second, do you still use the plugin robots?
Okay.
And the third one, which is like the speculation, like you were speaking about the 2008 crash, and that was a significant milestone, let's say, in the history But recently I was looking back even more, and like around the year 2000, there was the .com crash when all the websites and the internet was booming, and suddenly there was high value everywhere, and then it just crashed. And I find, not to be pessimistic about this moment right now, but I sort of kind of feel like there might be some overlap with the current Bitcoin and the whole NFT and this whole chunk of electronic commerce. So I don't know how to develop that question into
but
but if is there
I think I know what you're getting at. So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, so the first question for cost, I mean, it's important to say, like, I mean, the point is not to make it like to be cheap. I mean, cheap also has kind of a negative connotation, right? I mean, like ultimately, like, you know, if you really look at like the bottom of how cheaply you could build something, you can probably build cheaper than, you know, in the kind of discrete roboticized way that I'm showing you. But you will also have kind of, it will be cheap in the negative sense, right? You will have no quality at all, right? So like, obviously we're not competing with kind of the cheapest possible way of construction. It's just competing with how things today are constructed on average. So for example, the house extension that I showed you, that is 1,300 euros per square meter for like the house extension, which is, you know, the average in Belgium, a house extension costs between, you know, 1,200 to 2,000 euros. So that's a lower average. The concert hall was the same. So the concert hall was pitched like in the middle bracket of a cost. I very briefly showed you like a kind of a shed building that like with diamond parts, like a kind of a barn. That one was 1,600 euros per square meter. Which again, I mean, for a cultural building is very, very, very cheap. I mean, it would be normally for that kind of building, again, like in Belgian prices, you would be more around 2,500 to 3,000 euros. So it's definitely kind of, like for me, that was a big thing to discover we could deliver this on kind of relatively standard prices, but, you know, with all the qualities that come from it, right? Like you are delivering something that I jokingly like to say, like, you know, architectural qualities like a Frank Gehry, but it doesn't cost more, right? So that's a bit the point. And it's like quite expressive, quite exuberant, very, very unique, but it doesn't cost necessarily more. I've been criticized a lot for making this argument about efficiency. Like a lot of my fellow architect friends who are a bit older than me, who are advising me, they're always like, Gilles, we agree with everything you say, but you should never tell people that your work doesn't cost a lot of money, because it's worth a lot of money. Like you could sell it for a lot of money and it's worth it. Like people would pay for it. And you're telling them that they can get it cheaply. Like, why would you do that? It's so stupid, right? So this is kind of like, it's something like they're saying, like, you know, you should not, like, it's not you don't need it as a selling point. But I personally think it's important to say that it is in a way very efficient. It has an efficient basis. And like that should be the point, right? If we work with digital machines, we should make things more accessible. If we build so quickly and with so little steps, I mean, you should be able to both make money with it and produce it a bit cheaper, right? Yeah. And then robots, the plugin, yes, we are still using robots at the Bartlett. That's still being used. Yeah. And then the crisis, I mean, I was actually thinking your question would go more towards the pandemic crisis, because obviously the pandemic 2020 caused an economic crisis almost as big as 2008, right? The interesting thing is that in 2008, the reaction of governments was austerity. So they said basically, there's a financial crisis, but we'll not put more money in the economy. We'll actually take money out of the economy, which everyone, you know, a lot of economists like Piketty and, you know, they were like, this is crazy. You never solve a crisis by being austere. You solve a crisis by putting more money onto the market. So that's the difference with the crisis now with 2020. The outfall of the pandemic is that actually the the governments have put the kind of, are putting a lot of money in the market. So it's the end of austerity politics as we know it. Like everyone has, the reaction to the financial crisis is very, very different, which is really good news for architects, by the way, because that's money for like infrastructure, that's money for housing, for schools, for research. So it's actually a kind of a better situation. If we will get another bubble, as you're saying, like a brief NFT or Bitcoin or a housing bubble, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm always also thinking that will happen, but I don't know enough about that to kind of predict if that will happen. But there's definitely a lot of money looking for ways to speculate, right? If it's on housing or NFTs or Bitcoins.
We've got a question on Facebook, and maybe we can make the last call for questions after that. So this is the second to the last question. Romeo asked if the system that you're proposing can easily adapt to places with earthquake, or what is your opinion on that there are many moving parts?
Yeah, so that's actually, so what I was talking briefly about, I didn't explain that very well, about post-tensioned timber, like the idea that you don't make a fixed kind of mechanical joint, but you just tension two elements together. So, and I was saying that that system doesn't actually exist, and that's, it does exist, and there's one precedent for it. Like, I mean, it's still not exactly what I'm doing, but there is, technically speaking, there's a post-tension timber, which was actually developed by the ETH in collaboration with a university in New Zealand, specifically to work with earthquakes. Because basically, if you don't have a mechanical connection, it's just string together, your building can actually nicely move with the earthquake. I don't know anything about earthquakes. It's like I've never thought about that, but I just know the precedent is meant to deal with that. I wouldn't trust the things that I've built yet in terms of earthquakes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more questions? Like the last question, anyone here or on Facebook? Yeah, there is a question on Facebook. We are going to prioritize people here on Zoom. So anybody on Zoom wants to ask anything? Does anyone?
Maybe I will have last question, if I may.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Gilles. It was really amazing. I really love your lectures because you were really connecting theoretical thinking, architecture thinking, and I also see kind of your balancing on some way of not even scale of discrete elements, but also in kind of boundaries of kind of irony and really kind of deep understanding of the thing. And my question is simple one. I really love your work from the beginning, and it was for me kind of you trying to solve the problem of continuous shapes to really understand the fabrication and process of how to build them and bring this kind of new system which can follow this. And then your transition into, let's say, Nuremberg Concert Hall brings me, wow, it's going into the very different way. Because in this kind of building, we even don't need kind of computation design, right? It's just putting the element. So my question would be, what will be your next step?
Cool. Yeah. So first about Nuremberg. So I mean, I actually think that Nuremberg, it's obviously a very reduced design. I always make, when I present it in detail, I always make this joke about it, that basically, you know, it's an open German competition for a concert hall, right? So there's basically hundreds of offices doing a proposal. And so my strategy was like, knowing Germany, I was like, if we want to make it to the next round, we need to give them a box. And like, which kind of box do the Germans like best? You know, the best possible box, like literally a box, not a kind of stretched rectangle, you know, really a box, right? And then this box is actually Pandora's box, you know, the Greek myth of Pandora's box. So basically they selected us for the next round, thinking it would be a highly rational, super optimized German design. then turns out that nothing in this box is actually, you know, known construction industry stuff. The entire box does not exist as such from like any kind of standards. It's completely digitally manufactured offsite from, you know, sheets of timber that I put together. Like there's not even a floor plate in that thing. It's literally just a V-shaped element and a next V-shaped element, and you walk from one V-shape to another V-shape. So it's super, super radical in the way that it's constructed and completely, you know, with my ideology in it. Of course, it looks very reduced. It doesn't try to be very exciting. It doesn't try to kind of do some kind of insane, like formal moves or crazy cantilevers, because I mean, we wouldn't stand a chance, right? We only had a chance by putting it all in this box. But I think it's an extremely, extremely radical box. But I do agree with you that, and I've kind of, you know, written and thought a lot about it, is that I think there are kind of two modes of operation in my work. So one is the work that develops through the things that I built myself, the smaller scale. This is a bit more radical because I can do whatever I want. I control everything. I build it myself, right? So that work is almost, I think it's much closer to the work I was doing a few years ago. Like it's very much what jagged edges, and well, it's really expressive, and it's kind of very, yeah. I mean, it still bears. I mean, it still I think bears resemblance into the agent-based work that I was doing from a few years ago. And then the work that I'm doing on a larger scale, like the concert hall and the Helsinki like National Museum project, like the kind of large scale project, that is much more, I would call it compiled. So it has a very, very, it's really voxel based. It's really kind of, you take a voxel space, an element sits in a voxel, and it's very, very cold and compiled. Like it's like literally kind of stacked. It doesn't have a lot of kind of crazy formal maneuvers. And it's extremely rational to build because I mean, that's the way to in a way compete. But I don't see, you know, I'm conscious of like the difference between the two. I would say that they're both the same ideology, but they're kind of, one is a bit more free and one is a bit less free. And, you know, it's something that I have to negotiate with the work going forward. Like for me, it's not that I think that one is the way to go and the other one is not. I think it's something like I'm working on this small scale that I'm building and I'm doing these competitions, and they will hopefully kind of like land somewhere where you can actually convince someone to build this stuff. Right? Like I'm building another small project now in Belgium, not myself. For the first time, we're using a contractor to build it. And this is super interesting because with that, like he's a very good timber contractor, and you need to kind of try to convince people that, you know, to build these things, take the risk to do it for very little budgets, right? So that's, I think, quite an exciting game. But also, I mean, and you know, I do see the work more as I'm exploring a ton of options, and I think some work that I'm doing, you know, will also come back. Like I still love, I'm still a big fan of my fibers work, for example. I do like fibers, but you can't win a competition with fibers right now. But maybe, you know, in 10 years, when I've shown that I can build these projects, maybe I can come back and put some fibers in someone's face, right? That is possible. So, yeah. So the brief answer is I consider them all part of the same practice. They're not necessarily an evolution, but they're all on the table.
Probably it was the last question, but I have another one, just short question. Can you imagine yourself as a global player in 10 years?
Oh, I dream about that, but it's so difficult. Like, I think, you know...
Can you imagine it?
Huh?
Can you imagine it to be a global player, to have 300 architects employed?
Yeah, that's a plan, but it's not easy, right? But I mean, that's definitely, you know, like I think it's, you know, that's always been the ambition, right? I always wanted to like, that's what I was mentioning, the boutique practice thing. Like I'm obsessed with big practice as well. I want to like design big buildings. Like that's a reality, right? But I think like if you analyze it economically, I think it's, times have changed. I think it's very difficult for, even if you're not working experimentally, I think it's very difficult to not escape, to escape a boutique practice model. It's quite, yeah, like now you really, like in the last 30 years, you really have the emergence of these big corporate practices, which are doing all the kind of competitions. and it's very difficult, I think, to scale up now, given kind of how the economy works these days. But you know, my father always told me there's always a need for good architects. So who knows?
Look, that's what everybody was thinking about during communist regime, that never collapsed. So maybe that nowadays model of practice will collapse. So there is a chance. Let's see. We will see.
All right. Shall we call it the last question?
There is something on Facebook again.
Yeah, I know. But we said this is going to be until 8. So if you feel like answering the question on Facebook, then later on, it would be awesome. If not, I mean, we didn't have time.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for the invite and the amazing discussion. I really enjoyed being here, and I hope we can repeat it again with like in real life sometime.
Yeah, that's what we wish for all the time. Mainly thank you for spending the time with us. It was incredibly fruitful and inspiring, and also fun to listen to. So yeah, and I hope that there will be a good chance very, very soon.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, and
thank you, Imro.
Thanks, everybody.
See you soon.
Thank you.
And have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.